Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are 10 legendary cards that we might see in Knights of the Frozen Throne. So, of course, we know all about Knights of the Frozen Throne. It's taking place in Northrend. We've got Arthas, we've got Icecrown Citadel. So we have a pretty good idea for the theme of the expansion and the kinds of characters from Warcraft lore that are likely to show up. So I just wanted to say, okay, if we know where the expansion is taking place, if we know what kinds of characters are going to be in it, we might be able to speculate just a little bit on what cards might be showing up as new legendaries by taking the most iconic and the most important characters from that part of World of Warcraft specifically. So that's exactly what I'm going to do in this video. I've just gone through and I've handpicked 10 characters that I think are really important to Icecrown Citadel or Arthas or Northrend, that theme essentially, and I've created a custom card for each of them. Now, clearly the odds that any of my cards look remotely close to the actual cards Blizzard would produce, or the fact that I even get any of these characters right, are pretty slim at best, but I still think it's really fun to just speculate and come up with cool ideas and see what things might look like, because we're all just so into the hype of the expansion that it's really enjoyable to just guess and try to figure out and try to theorize and theory craft what all this might be about. So that said, let's just go ahead and jump into my list here of 10 custom legendary Knights of the Frozen Throne cards that I've created just for you guys. Up first is the card absolutely no one wants to see, but YoggSaron is pretty important to Northrend because he was the final boss of the Ulduar raid, which was the raid before Icecrown Citadel. And of course we've seen YoggSaron before in Whispers of the Old Gods, but Blizzard has already shown that they're more than willing to dedicate multiple cards to a single character. So this is YoggSaron Flesh's Curse, and as you can see, I very lazily just mirrored the exact version of YoggSaron we have today, but I made it minions instead of spells. And I mostly did this as a joke just to trigger you guys out there and create a lot of nightmare scenarios for everyone where this becomes a real thing and we have to deal with another YoggSaron. Although for the record, I don't think this one would be quite as bad as the real one that exists today. But the reason I actually made this one is because in the history of Warcraft lore, this one's actually much more fitting to what YoggSaron does. And that's essentially that he was the originator of the Curse of Flesh, it was called, in which he took all these Titan beings and slowly corrupted them over time and took them from sort of metallic / stone beings and turned them into the fleshy humans and dwarves and everything else that we know today. So the Curse of Flesh was a real thing. So essentially he's a lot more to do with minions and bodies and beings than he ever really was a lot to do with spells. So this one seems a lot more fitting. Essentially he's turning stuff into minions, right? Every minion that was summoned in the past, guess what? It's coming back as another random minion with this version of YoggSaron. I don't think this card would be nearly as good, because presumably it would also summon minions for your opponent, much like yourself, so the odds of ever actually high rolling would be pretty slim. The only real advantage here would just be as a sort of last out card, exactly like YoggSaron is now, where if your opponent was already had on board, you could play this version of YoggSaron and theoretically get 6 giant taunt minions, maybe you get 6 earth elementals, right, that help you stabilize and win the game. But I still don't think that'd be as strong as the YoggSaron we have now, which can pretty consistently clear the board and generate tons of extra value. In other words, there is a cap on how much value this version of YoggSaron could generate, because you're only ever going to get 6 minions, and often those 6 minions just won't be that strong, because there's a lot of 1/1s and a lot of 5/5s and only a couple Tyrion kinds of cards out there, right? So probably wouldn't be nearly as unhealthy for Hearthstone as the current YoggSaron. Also probably a little bit less fun, and I don't think we'll ever really see this card. This one's here mostly for the memes. So let's move on to a card that I do think would be real, and that's Deathbringer Saurfang here, a warrior legendary minion I've made. And this guy's pretty prominent in the storyline of Icecrown Citadel. Tragically significant. Also a boss in Icecrown Citadel's raid. So a great character to set up for a card here, and fitting for warrior as well. And as far as this card is concerned, I actually took the raid boss as inspiration. Essentially with this raid boss, when he would do damage to things, he would grow in damage and in strength. Probably not quite as quickly as this particular card, but still the design is inspired by the actual fight. And this would start as a 2/2, but at the end of the turn, so after you play this, sort of like Baron Geddon at the end of the turn, he's going to do 1 damage to all characters, heroes and minions alike. So there could be a total, and himself actually too, based on the wording here. It's not all other characters, it's all characters. So in total, that could be up to 16 characters on a full board. And then he gains +1/+1 for each damage he deals via that method. So he could actually gain +16/+16 in a single turn. He would take a damage, so he'd be a 16/15 minion if there was a full board out there, which is most of the time very, very unlikely. More likely is that there's just, maybe a couple minions on the board and the heroes. So you're probably often dealing with things like 4/4, 5/5, maybe 6/6. And occasionally you can high roll and maybe he gets +8/+8 and he's a 10/9 minion for 6 mana. But essentially it gives the player a lot of power and control over when they do that. Not to mention that whirlwind effects, of course, like this one, although this is on a delay, are still often very beneficial for Warrior, particularly when there's some additional upside tied into Saurfang himself here. So, really like the design of this card. I'm really happy with how this one turned out. It fits what Warrior wants to do. It fits the character's lore and mechanics a lot. And it seems like a pretty balanced card that sometimes could be a defensive tool to whirlwind a board of small stuff and give yourself a body, but ultimately it's not overpowered because it's just stats at the end of the day, and often just mediocre stats at that. So I think this one's pretty cool. So let's move on to the next card, which is a crazy one, but I'm also really happy with how this one turned out. This is Chromie, of course, the bronze dragon who often masquerades as a gnome. And this would be a 10 mana card. She's a dragon, of course, even though she mostly looks like a gnome. She's truly a dragon. Not much in stats, though, because she's not the most prominent dragon ever as far as strength or power is concerned. But her battle cry, because, of course, bronze dragons, as we've seen with Nozdormu already in the game, are all about manipulating time. And that's exactly what Chromie would do. With this card, when you play it, it will revert the game, the entire game, to the start of your previous turn. So let's build a scenario here so you can envision this. Let's say you're playing like a token deck against a control mage. You're on turn 9, and you don't know if they have a flame strike or not. So you're just hoping they don't, and you play a giant board of 4 health minions. You've got 7 4-health minions out there. You pass the turn back to them. They flame strike your entire board, and you're like, oh crap, I am screwed. Those were all of my resources. So you go into turn 10, and you have Chromie in hand. And you're like, okay, let's do this. You play Chromie. You go back to the start of your 9 mana turn. All of the cards that you had, except for Chromie, because she's lost to time, as the card text dictates here. Every other card, though, that you played, return to your hand. The Flame Strike your opponent played, return to their hand. The board state is reverted exactly back. The cards you drew are put back in the same slot in the deck, so you would draw the same cards in the same order once again based on this. It'd just be for 1 turn, though. But everything, the health totals, the entire game is reverted. It's as if the previous 2 turns, the turn you play Chromie and your opponent's turn, don't happen. You go straight back to your previous turn, and you get a redo. You get a do-over. You say, okay, I know they have the Flame Strike. So now I'm going to change my play. I'm going to play an Aya and a thing from below instead of building a giant board of stuff because I'm playing around that Flame Strike. And then you pass it back to your opponent. Maybe a Flame Strike's still to play. They Flame Strike ping. Maybe they don't. Maybe they do something else. Maybe they polymorph the Aya instead, right? But essentially, it gives you a do-over. It's not really changing anything as far as like tempo is concerned. It's not like a Vanish effect where you're removing the mana that your opponent spent. They're getting the same opportunities to spend the same mana with the same cards. It's more of a strategic maneuver than an actual game mechanic maneuver. It's more of an information resource gathering than it is an actual change in the game state, right? It's just about information and posturing and gesturing with your opponent and the strategic decisions that you're each making, because you're giving the same amount of control back to them. They also know that you have all those minions in hand. So it's just the kind of card that would be an interesting little tech addition to certain decks that allow you to revert your mistakes, allow you to learn a little bit about your opponent's deck and their hand and their resources without really being particularly overpowered. So perhaps there are maybe some weird ways to interact with this card that I haven't foreseen, but outside of that, I really like what it accomplishes and how it interacts with the game. I think it would be really cool time manipulation that's really quite possible in a digital environment. I also heard apparently there's some kind of card that's similar to this in Magic the Gathering that allows you to revert the game back to the very beginning or something of the sort. So maybe borrowing from that idea a little bit unknowingly, but at a much, much smaller and much more controllable scale. So I'm really happy with how Chromie turned out. Moving on to my next card, this one is Professor Putricide, another raid boss from Icecrown Citadel. And of course, that raid boss has a bunch of different shenanigans with potions and oozes and all kinds of crazy stuff. But before you kill him, you go and you kill essentially his pets, Fester Gut and Rotface. So I wanted to integrate those with the Professor Putricide card. And what this ends up looking like is a bit like a Cenarius or maybe a Dr. Boom kind of card where you summon a few minions at a pretty reasonable cost. And depending on how your opponent interacts with those, you might get some benefits back. So at a base level, you play Professor Putricide. He summons you 2/2/2 taunts, so it looks a lot like Cenarius. It's just Putricide's a 4/4 instead of a 5/8, so you can see why the mana costs are pretty similar. And then if your opponent kills Fester Gut and Rotface first, before they're able to kill the Putricide, so in other words, if they're probably a more minion-based deck and they have to push through those taunts, then your Putricide becomes a 7/7, as opposed to just a 4/4, because each one is giving him a different kind of buff. Or, you know, if they have one Frostbolt but have to attack the other, they can actually dictate, do I make Putricide a 7/4, or do I make Putricide a 4/7? And they get to have those decisions play in a way that's pretty smart for them, or, you know, most advantageous to their lines, or their given resources. But, you know, if they don't have answers, you also get to make the same trades, dictating back. You kill your Fester Gut first, or, you know, whatever it might be to buff your Putricide to make a trade while keeping your Rotface alive, or vice versa. I just like the idea of being able to control the buffs via the minions, making smart lines and making smart plays. We don't have enough cards in Hearthstone that really reward these kinds of things. Even though this is a simple one, this isn't very complex at all, it's still the kind of thing we don't often see. So at the end of the day, if everything goes right, you get a total of 11/11 in stats for 6 mana, because you get a 7/7 and 2/2/2s. So that's really good across 3 bodies. That would be really fantastic high roll. But even if your opponent kills the Putricide first, you're still getting an 8/8 for 6 mana. Couple taunt minions, just a wide board, reloading the board. This feels like the kind of card that wouldn't be overpowered at all, but could fit in more tempo or mid-rangey rogue deck, particularly because there are some Death Rattle minions here. And Rogue has seen a lot of synergies with Death Rattle as well. So this is a cool way to sneak some additional Death Rattle minions in there, particularly small ones with Taunt that would synergize really nicely with N'Zoth, for instance, just because you're getting a couple small Taunt putties back. Even though the Death Rattle effects wouldn't have much value because you wouldn't be getting Putricide back, you could still just get the bodies, which is nice. So, works for the class, thematically makes a lot of sense for the character. I'm pretty happy with this one. It's not the craziest idea or anything, but feels balanced and feels like it'd be a pretty fun card to run for Rogue. Moving on to the next card, we have Sindragosa, the Frost Worm of Arthas, another Icecrown Citadel boss. This one's a dragon, of course. Arguably not really a dragon because it's sort of undead and raised from the dead, but I think a dragon classification is still fine. A 9 mana 8/8 stat line, which we've seen very commonly with other dragons, and a neat little battle cry here where you could permanently freeze an enemy that could be both an enemy hero or an enemy minion. Now, I don't think this would be a widely utilized card because I'm just not sure that effect is good enough, but occasionally if a weapon class were to dominate the meta where they just use a lot of weapons, Sindragosa could do a lot of work where they just lock out a weapon forever. Even against like paladins, and you know, they're playing that Tyrion, you could permanently freeze that Tyrion or permanently freeze the Ashbringer that they get off of the Tyrion and make those kinds of plays. Freezing a taunt minion probably wouldn't be very good though, but if your opponent had some other giant thing, maybe they buffed this Frothing Berserker to high heavens, you could actually just freeze the Frothing Berserker and never actually have to deal with it. So a little bit of flexibility here. It could be the kind of card that slots into dragon decks occasionally as a good tech answer. I don't think it gives you enough late game value on average to make this a very commonly run card, but also remember, just adding dragons into the card list and allowing them to be picked off things like Netherspite Historian, for instance, can go a long way too, because sometimes maybe you're playing against a weapon class, you play Netherspite Historian, you hit Sindragosa, and you're thrilled because you can freeze out that weapon for the rest of the game because they are permanently frozen. So it would not be clearly the best card ever. I think this one's on the weaker side on average, but at the end of the day, it just fits what the character and the tribe of dragon seems to do, so I'm still relatively happy with this one despite some inherent weaknesses. Moving on to the next card, we have a Paladin Legendary, Vindicator Maraad, a pretty popular Draenei Paladin in the lore who was prominent in the Northrend campaign as well. And just a Paladin that needs to be in the game already, so I just had to make Vindicator Maraad. This is a 9-mana, 4/6 minion, and when you look at his effect, you probably start thinking about a card like Kel'Thuzad most directly. Whenever a friendly minion dies, when Vindicator Maraad is on the board, you would then summon that minion again and give it Divine Shield. So much like Kel'Thuzad summons minions at the end of the turn after they've all died in a given turn, Vindicator Maraad actually does it live instead of at the end of the turn. Most of the time that doesn't really make much of a difference, except with things like charge minions, where you could play a charge minion alongside Vindicator Maraad, charge it, it instantly gets resummoned, and you get to charge again, which is really nice. Now, importantly, if you weren't giving the minion Divine Shield when it was resummoned, then you could actually just charge minions and chain that forever to clear an opponent's board, just constantly trading Vindicator Maraad and a Stone Tusk Boar into an entire board until the entire board was dead, but the Divine Shield prevents any cheesiness there. But really, at the end of the day, this is just giving Paladin a kind of Kel'Thuzad style effect. I mean, Kel'Thuzad is the kind of card that when you played it in a control matchup was crazy powerful, but still never really dominated the meta or felt like an impressive card. I think it would be okay to give Paladin the same kind of card. The stats on Maraad are a little bit worse, the mana cost a little bit worse, so I don't think it would be inherently as strong as Kel'Thuzad, not to mention Divine Shields. While good, don't always make a huge change, but you could clearly see some synergies here with cheap taunt minions, running those Stonehill Defenders in, getting back a 1/4 Divine Shield taunt. Could be really frustrating for your opponents, but at the end of the day, it's still a win more kind of card. It's not a comeback card, so you have to be in a pretty strong position to really get any value out of this guy, and it's still a fairly easy target for your opponents to remove at 6 health. So feels like it could fit in a really late game control Paladin deck without being overpowering or dominant. And honestly, this is probably still not any better than the other Paladin legendaries, of which it has a ton of really, really good ones. So a fitting card for the class without giving Paladin too much firepower, I think. I just like the design of this one. It feels clean, efficient, good, but not crazy good. And I like the artwork, and it all matches up really well, because Vindicator Maraad, and frankly more Draenei, need to be in the game in general, so I'd like to see this one. Up next, we have a Hunter Legendary Minion that'll look pretty familiar. Of course, this is another version of Sylvanas. Once again, we've seen this happen a few times already. This time, Sylvanas is a 5-mana card, much like the old Sylvanas. She also has a Death Rattle that's really similar to her last one. Clearly, I took a lot of inspiration here from the original Sylvanas, mostly because I just want to see her back in the game, and this would be a way to do it. Putting her specifically in Hunter to avoid some of the problems we saw with Sylvanas in the past. She fits in Hunter, of course, because she uses bows and arrows. That's good enough logic for me. She used to be a Ranger General as well, so I think it all lines up. Not to mention Death Rattle minions in Hunter. That's a theme we've seen too, so I like Sylvanas as a good fit in Hunter. But this Death Rattle is slightly different than our previous version. This time, instead of basically stealing an enemy minion when Sylvanas dies, this summons a friendly copy of the last enemy minion that died, which has all kinds of different implications than the card that we knew in the past. Perhaps sometimes it's a lot worse because it doesn't create quite as much friction on the board, and your opponent can trade in ways where they, finish off Sylvanas with the 1/1 minion, and then you just get a 1/1 back. And then essentially you played Sylvanas as a 5/5 with an additional 1/1. You get 6/6 in stats for 5 mana. Not the worst play ever, because a 5/5 for 5 at the end of the day is decent, but still not the high roll you were looking for. But then there are other instances where, especially with Hunter synergy cards with Death Rattle and things like Spirit Singer, Umbra, for instance, you can play this instantly, and you know that Tyrion was the last thing you killed. You play your Sylvanas with Spirit Singer, Umbra, you summon a Tyrion. So it puts a little bit more control in your hands, because you can also dictate when Sylvanas is activated, as opposed to in the past, sometimes you left it up to randomness. It was a 1 in 4 chance to get something good. This time there's a little bit more control about when you play her, and sometimes how you activate the Death Rattle. Particularly if you play her out there on an empty board and your opponent only has an Ashbringer, for instance, to kill her, then they have to give you that Tyrion back. Or if they use a Fireball, maybe you get the Mage's Medivh. There's all kinds of different times you could play this where it makes a lot of sense. Now, clearly this wouldn't fit in every version of Hunter. Probably would be much better in a control-style Hunter, but it looks like that is, in fact, what Blizzard's trying to emphasize. So I think this card could see some play in a Death Rattle or Control Hunter deck, and it's one I'd certainly like, a character I'd certainly like to see brought back to life, if you will. So I'd be excited if this were actually a real card for Hunter. But you can't have Sylvanas in Northrend without Veramathris, the demon. This would be a 9-mana, 9/9 demon, and as you can see, pretty crazy effects as a base here. Taunt, Divine Shield, and Lifesteal. So I guess this would kind of be a giant Tyrion Forge Ring, basically a big bundle of stats, a big body to get through, but because Veramathris is inevitably going to betray you, much like he has betrayed Sylvanas, the battle cry here is rather punishing. You deal 9 damage to your hero in the demon style of things like Flame Imp with Warlock. There is a big downside to getting Veramathris on your side. Clearly he's the kind of minion you'd love to have. If your opponent in particular doesn't have single target removal, this guy's going to do a ton of work, and he might instantly heal you back through that battle cry. But there's going to be other instances where you simply can't afford to play Veramathris because it will kill you or it'll put you in lethal range. So I like how there's this really nice balancing act here with Veramathris about when you can play him and when you can't, and perhaps in the kinds of decks you could play him. For instance, Warrior, a control Warrior deck with tons of armor, would probably love to run Veramathris because, you know, they have tons of armor and health to work with, and then they get this really strong 9-mana minion that has enough effects and against the right kinds of decks would be devastating. A Pirate Warrior would not be able to beat Veramathris, but that's why this is a 9-mana card and not a 6-mana card, because by the time you get to 9 mana, control decks in my mind should be rewarded for playing a card like this, and for playing that late into the game, they get a really strong card like this with tons of upside potential that really rewards you perfectly if your opponent can't answer it, but at the end of the day still dies to Deadly Shot, right? So, of course, there are balancing acts for really strong minions in Hearthstone, and this would fit right in. So, I like this card, just a neutral Tyrion-style card with a ton of downside all the same. Adding another demon to the list of cards, too, which we just don't have neutral demons in Hearthstone, and Warlock might be able to utilize this, but it would be pretty risky and pretty hard, other than demon summoning cards, of which there are a few in Warlock, so things like Kroll the Unshackled, for instance, could really make use of Veramathris because they get to play him without the battle cry, making that a pretty absurd play. But frankly, Kroll the Unshackled needs some absurd plays to actually be a great card, so this would fit right in as well. So both neutral set would be rewarded with Veramathris, and Warlocks would like him too, so I'm pretty happy with how this one feels, and I think it'd be a great card in the game. Bone Storm! I can't do the Bone Storm voice, but if you guys don't know, Lord Marigar, the first boss in Icecrown Citadel, I guess very famous for saying Bone Storm above everything else, so I had to put Bone Storm on the card here. This is a Warlock legendary minion, though, because I figured, hey, it's a giant pile of bones. That seems like something Warlock would like to enjoy. Plus, I actually designed this card a little bit around what Warlock's all about, because, you know, when you've got a Bone Storm and you're throwing bones all around, it felt a bit like this battle cry, where you can discard your entire hand, so basically the Deathwing effect, and you get to deal 3 damage to a random enemy for each card that you discarded. So again, a lot like Deathwing here as a sort of all-in card where you sacrifice all of your resources and you get a huge advantage in the process. Sometimes this would work exactly like Deathwing, where you just clear your opponent's board and maybe chip away at their health a little bit as well when you play Lord Marigar, which would be really nice. Sometimes you could use this as a win condition if your opponent doesn't have anything on the board and you have 7 cards in hand. This is a 21 damage to the face battle cry. And a lot of people are going to say, that's kind of overpowered, Regis. You're giving Warlock a really good high damage win condition. But my challenge to that statement is, this is a 10 mana card that's very hard to play a lot of the time because it's just so risky to discard your hand, particularly if your opponent has like 5 1-health minions. you have 7 cards in hand, you get to clear a board of 1/1s and do 6 damage to their face. That's not a great play because you're only developing a 3/7. Remember, you're not developing a Deathwing style 12/12 body to finish the game either. So if Deathwing can be a card, I think Lord Marogar actually feels a little bit worse than Deathwing in a lot of scenarios. And frankly, if you've gotten to turn 10 or later and you still have 9 other cards in hand and your opponent doesn't have any minions on the board and hasn't almost killed you or already killed you, you kind of deserve to win, right? Like, that means you've got a ton of resources in hand. They haven't developed anything. You're already so far ahead in the game that it's not a problem if this is an instant win condition. I'm quite okay with that because it takes cards in hand for this to be any good. In an environment where you're just barely scraping by, you're working with 3 or 4 cards in your hand, Lord Marogar's a lot worse, right? Because 4 cards in hand means 12 damage to the board, most of the time just hitting a couple minions along the way. And also keep in mind that unlike Cthulhu, which always does it in 1 damage iterations that very cleanly, if it hits a 1/1, it's only using 1 damage. Lord Marogar, if it hits a 1 health minion, it's wasting 2 damage. So a lot of the damage on Marogar actually gets lost here, so I don't think it's quite as problematic as a card like Cthulhu, and certainly not a Cthulhu replacement. So at the end of the day, I think there are enough checks and balances here, both in the card's design, but also in the kinds of points in the game in which it would be good, that despite how potentially strong this Battlecry is, I don't actually think it would feel that bad or be that oppressive in a real game environment. And then finally, I have one last card here, the Spirit of Taranis. If you're not familiar, Taranis is Arthas' father, who, as you can probably see in this card art, Arthas actually murders way back in the day, and then at the end of Icecrown Citadel, after you, well, not actually after, but as you're defeating Arthas, essentially Arthas kills you the entire raid, and Taranis comes back and resurrects everybody and saves the day, right? So he's sort of your last hope here. He's getting, I guess, revenge or atoning for Arthas' sins by bringing the raid back to life alongside Tyrion Fordring, and that's exactly what this card is about. This card is sort of a last resort. This card is almost a neutral ice block in a way. Taranis, he's just a ghost, so he's a meager 1 mana, 1/1. He's not the kind of card you'd ever want to play. But if he's in your hand, whenever you take lethal damage, Spirit of Taranis would essentially pop out and block that lethal damage. So if you're at 5 health and your opponent fireballs your face, if you have Spirit of Taranis in your hand, he's going to block that fireball. You're going to stay at 5 health, and you're going to get a 1 mana 1/1 taunt on the board. So not quite as powerful as Ice Block, right? Because it's not making you immune for the rest of the turn, so it's not nearly as bad as Ice Block in that regard, but still just a last resort, kind of a freebie card in your deck to block some damage, to save you some health. Against something like a Pirate Warrior, for instance, if they use a Kor'kron Elite to hit you for lethal, and it gets blocked, right? The damage is negated by Spirit of Taranis. Then they might have to run that Arcanite Reaper into this 1 mana 1/1 taunt. That saves you 4 more damage, gives you a little bit of time to stabilize moving into your next turn. You recover and you win the game. It's that kind of card. But ultimately, if they have a Whirlwind effect, guess what? You're still screwed. They're going to hit you with the Arcanite Reaper because it's only a 1 mana 1/1 taunt. So just a little bit extra, a little bit of a sneaky kind of card. It could fit in all kinds of different decks. If Mage can have Ice Block, I don't see why everybody else can't get a slightly different version of it that's not nearly as good, but would still be tons of fun when it came off Discover Effects and got added to your hand randomly, those kinds of things. Being able to pick Spirit of Taranis would feel really good. Just having it available in the card pool is a really rewarding kind of thing. Even if it's not a card people necessarily ran in their decks, there are those kinds of cards in Hearthstone that just exist for those fun random moments, for those crazy highlights. And I think Spirit of Taranis would be one of those cards without feeling particularly bad or oppressive for players. And there you go, guys. Those are my 10 legendary custom cards I made for Knights of the Frozen Throne. I'm actually pretty happy with how all these turned out. I think there's a lot of different fun little mechanics. They really fit the lore and the story of Frozen Throne. I'd love if Blizzard made cards that looked like these, but I'm curious what you guys think. Would you like to see these cards? Would these feel good to play? Would they feel bad to play against perhaps? What do you think about Chromie? What do you think about Spirit of Taranis? What do you think about Lord Marrowgar? What are your thoughts? Share it with me. Let me know if I did a great job, a bad job, or if you don't really care, you just want to see the real cards. I'm still curious what you have to say. So leave all those thoughts in the comments. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.